We have joining us today as our on-air guest, Ken O'Keefe, who is very well-known individual. He's a former resident of Hawaii. A lot of cool people live here in Hawaii, and it was on the Mavi Marama, the aid ship that was attacked by Israel last May. A lot of stuff to tell us about that. So, Ken, welcome to the show, and thank you for spending time with us this morning.
It's my pleasure to be here, brother. Nothing but love and respect to you and all the good things you're doing, the truth telling you're doing, vital. The most important thing that a person can probably do in this day and age is tell the truth, and you're doing one hell of a job.
Well, thank you very much. And if we're all out there speaking about what we feel and what we are concerned about, it'll give everybody else around us the courage to speak out. And that is how a public popular consensus will form in the face of continued government efforts to divide us against each other with, obviously, this Trayvon shooting down in Florida is being used to set the whites against the blacks so that we fight amongst ourselves and forget that the real enemy of the American people is Wall Street's criminality and Washington, D.C.'s corruption. This is classic divide and conquer. They did the same thing back during the protests against the Vietnam War. Now they're trying to do it again here. Anyway, so Ken, I was doing a little bit of web searching around, and I saw all these really terrible things said about you by various people in Israel, that you're a terrorist commando and all these other amazing things, and I'm very jealous of this stuff. But, if you're catching flack like that, you're obviously over the target. And so would you just give our listeners a brief rundown on your activism and your adventures on the high seas last May?
Well, most of the viewers probably are aware of the fact that the Mavi Marmara was attacked by the Israelis on its way to carry out a humanitarian aid mission. And, I have to say, I actually did not think that the Israelis would do that. Keep in mind that I had traveled to Gaza on the first mission by sea to Gaza in over 41 years on the first Free Gaza mission. And the Israelis said basically all the same things about us on that mission, which was back in 2008, August of 2008. And at the end of the day, they did not do what they did with the Mavi Marmara. We got through. And I have different perspectives now as to why we managed to get through at that point, and we didn't on the Mavi Marmara. But at the end of the day, I didn't think that the Israelis would be as stupid as they were. And regardless of the fact that we didn't actually arrive in Gaza, I don't think anything did more for the cause of Palestine in terms of raising awareness and exposing the criminality of Israel more than what happened on that particular day. And this is kind of the reality of the world that we live in. We're facing an incredibly powerful, evil, tyrannical force. We cannot stop them from doing what they're capable of doing. I mean, at the end of the day, they can launch nukes. I mean, we are sitting on the verge of World War III, which I know very well you've been talking about. Mm-hmm. And as much as we might want to live in la-la land and bury our heads in the sand like the proverbial ostrich, we're flirting with our own self-destruction. But even I didn't think the Israelis were going to do what they did. At the end of the day, the bottom line is this. I mean, if you don't know what Israel, the state of Israel, the Jewish state of Israel is all about, then you're clearly blind. This situation in Gaza is deteriorated over the course of, decades. But in the last 5 years, they've been dealing with a blockade, which is a blatant form of collective punishment. People should keep in mind that Gaza, which is one of the most heavily populated areas in the world, is populated by a population with over 50% children. So there's approximately 850,000 children in Gaza. And every day they have drones flying overhead, they have F-16s flying overhead, they have helicopter gunships flying overhead. And I'd entertain people to ponder the reality of when they hear a plane flying overhead or a helicopter flying overhead, does it instill any kind of fear or any kind of trauma? It assuredly doesn't if you come from the West. But when you live in Gaza, and especially if you're a child who has experienced the kind of bombardment that they've experienced in Gaza, this is a form of terrorism. And this is the kind of thing that happens on a daily basis, literally, in a place like Gaza. Never mind the kind of terrorism that's occurring in the West Bank every day as well. And this is just the reality. But, I'll tell you what, Michael, the thing for me at this point is I'm really quite sick and tired of blaming Israel. We know what Israel is. We know what they do. And to pretend as if we don't know this is to act as if we're complete idiots and fools. We do know what they do. And the bottom line is that our governments, the U.S. government in particular, my birth nation, and the European governments as well, they all support this. And if we believe that we live in so-called democracies, we have to accept responsibility. And this is the main point that I think we must comprehend if we are really serious about affecting a better world. And that is that if we are continuously content to shift the blame to someone else, whether it's Republican or Democrat, Tory, Labor, this government, that government, this nation, that nation, as long as we're continuously satisfied to blame someone else, shift the blame away from ourselves, then nothing will change. Only when we take responsibility for the actions of our so-called representatives will anything change. And as of right now, we have not done that. And that means, in my opinion, that it is shame upon all of us. I consider myself, and I consider everyone who sits in these so-called democracies who has not done nearly enough to confront these tyrannical systems. I consider all of us guilty more than the actual tyrants themselves.
Well, I think we would differ in a question of degree, but not in terms of the fundamental truth of what you're saying. Ultimately, when you go back to the Constitution of the United States of America, up there at the very top, those 3 words written extra large, we the people. It's our country, it's our contract, and ultimately it is up to us to hold the government to the letter of the law under which we allow them to rule over us. There is no question that Israel's government is following a very, very dangerous expansionist policy. It is equally true that a great many of the people living in Israel don't agree or support what their government is doing, just as there are a great number of people in the United States of America and Europe and Canada who don't support this push toward this new world war. Ultimately, I think more and more Americans are standing up and saying we don't want to go along with this Israel-centric policy any longer. In fact, Israel seems to be almost befuddled by the realization that the American people are not as easy to talk into a war in Iran as they had earlier presumed we were going to be, and now they're kind of thrashing around trying to find some traction as the American people work to try and get the Israel firsters out of our own government. We're now confronted with the reality of massive epidemic vote fraud, which means we have lost control of our government. At the same time, Israel's agents in place, AIPAC, are buying control of the American government. I remember when I was a kid in grade school, we were always warned about communist subversives, communists infiltrating the government and taking us over for the benefit of the Soviet Union. And it turns out we were looking in the wrong direction. There are subversives, but they're not working for the Soviet Union. They're in fact working for Israel. And it's the, AIPAC is out there with all the money and influence that they've got. We know that they will support candidates who are going to be pro-Israel. They will go out of their way to destroy candidates who are pro-America, like Cynthia McKinney, who are asking these very real questions of why our money and our children are being sacrificed for Israel's expansionist policies. And we need to regain control of our government, or we basically need to get a new government, one of the two.
Well, I'll grant you that. There's no question at all that the consciousness of humanity is rising at a pace never before experienced in human existence. There's no question of that. And I'm not denying the fact that there are many good people out there, in fact, ever-increasing numbers. Again, there is no question of that. But at the end of the day, Michael, I think you'll have to agree with me that we are the masses. We have far more people than those corrupt prostitutes who pose as politicians within all of these so-called democracies. And at the end of the day, the only reason why they can get away with what they do is because we're allowing that to happen. Now, when you think about people who live in Iraq or Palestine or other occupied lands, they are putting their lives on the line every day. This isn't about, I might lose my job if I say the wrong thing, or, I might find that people are going to criticize me for saying this if I say it. It's not like that. They're literally putting their lives on the line. And I ask you, what are we doing? Are we literally putting our lives on the line? So some of us, very, very few of us. And we're not willing to pay that price. Why? Because we don't really look at the people in Palestine, the people of Iraq, as our brothers and sisters. Because if we did, we could not do anything other than put our lives on the line in defense of our brothers and sisters. And until we look at the world that way and are willing to pay the same kind of price for these people who live in these distant lands that we would for our own brother or sister or our own son or daughter, until we're willing to take responsibility for their fate and actually do everything that we're capable of doing. We are, whether we like it or not, complicit. And I don't say this to be antagonistic. I say this because I think any fair assessment of the reality of this world is we have the power, and yet we have relinquished that power, whether it's based on fear, ignorance, whatever it is. We've relinquished that power, and therefore these actions are being carried out. And if we didn't allow it, it could not happen. That's the bottom line.
Well, I agree with you, and I think an issue that people need to be aware of, if we allow this kind of dehumanization and isolation of the Palestinians, by this Jewish state, sooner or later it's going to start happening here. We're going to see the wall start going up here. We're already seeing the deliberate focused targeting of Muslims by New York Police Department's espionage and profiling efforts, and yet it was Israelis, Mossad agents, who were arrested at the World Trade Center on 9/11. And so we're already beginning to see what I call the Zionification of the United States of America. And so this is not a problem that's occurring on the other side of the world. Sooner or later, if we allow Israel to treat non-Jews the way they are in the Middle East, sooner or later it's going to start happening here. We already see how the preponderance of the so-called security funding post 9/11 overwhelmingly goes to synagogues and Jewish institutions to the exclusion of everybody else. There's already a bias and a favoritism toward this one special group showing up in the legislation of the United States of America.
I'm really happy you say that, because you're helping me come back to the same point, and that is that ultimately, when we can start to consider the hardships that we're ever increasingly feel, especially in the West now with this so-called financial crisis, which is nothing more than a manufactured event to manipulate us all the more, nothing more than a continuation of the same kind of manipulations that have been happening throughout history. I'm actually really very happy for the financial crisis. I am very much looking forward to times getting so hard that people cannot ignore what other people are experiencing and have been experiencing in the so-called third world for how long? How long? They've been dealing with this kind of stuff for not only decades, we're talking centuries. And you know what happens when people get to a point where life becomes so difficult that they have no way to live their life in dignity? They actually stand up and are willing to put their lives on the line. And the only reason why we don't put our lives on the line generally is one of two factors. One, we're too ignorant to realize that our own existence, our own life with liberty and dignity is threatened. Or two, we're too afraid. And those two factors are what explains why we have not done what we've done. Many of us are ignorant. Many of us are afraid. Only a small minority are willing to face the fact that we do have a human family, that many members within our human family are dealing with things that we would not tolerate for one day for ourselves or for our direct family. But we allow these things to continue for others because we still don't quite see them as our brothers and sisters. We don't do what we're capable of doing. When we decide to take full responsibility for the actions of our so-called representatives, we will solve our problems and we will have a better world. But until such time, we will find the capacity to blame others, to shift the blame, and until that time, we will not solve our problems. So, I don't marginalize or underestimate the power of the raising consciousness of humanity. It is a beautiful thing. When I see in the Arab world with the Arab uprisings, as much as people want to say it's all CIA instigated and all this kind of stuff.
Okay, I'm sorry to cut you off because you're doing so well, but we got to take a break for commercials.